we'll start off with, I think that because I'm a urologist and I deal with kidney cancers and prostate tumours and so on and so forth, let's start with your medical condition, Wes, which you've been open about, and we were talking before. So tell us a little bit about that, what happened to you,
yeah, so
kidney-wise.
It's just over a year now since I had an operation to remove my left kidney because I had a low-grade kidney cancer, and it was we were talking about this before, but it was by total chance that the tumour was identified. I went into King George Hospital, which is my local hospital, on the 3rd of March last year, which I can remember very clearly because it was budget day, so I was very disappointed to be missing the budget. But I went in with chronic acute pain very early in the morning and was kind of advised by the NHS to call an ambulance, but my partner drove me in.
Via casualty you went in?
I went in via an A&E and had a scan. They identified kidney stone on my left kidney, but also said, look, there's something else on your kidney that we want to investigate. It's probably nothing to worry about given your age and your health, but we want to reassure ourselves and reassure you that it's just some fatty tissue or something kind of completely harmless. And over the course of the sort of subsequent weeks, I had a couple of scans. One was, I think, a scan I wasn't supposed to have. I had an ultrasound, which was interesting to the extent that it told me, basically they ruled out at that ultrasound all of the benign things that I'd been previously reassured it was. All the reasons I shouldn't worry were ruled out. And the guy who did the ultrasound said, yeah, you really need a contrast-use CT scan. And I said, well, I thought that's what I was coming in for. And he said, you've got to chase this, time's of the essence in these cases. There's probably nothing to worry about, but time is of the essence, and you have to keep on chasing the NHS. And that was the first time I Googled kidney cancer, because there was something about, the urgency in which he was saying you need to follow up that made me think, is this a cancer? And of course, maybe kidney cancer isn't one of those cancers that are talked about so often. Partly, I guess, because if you catch it early, as they did in my case, the outcomes are so good. So, whereas, if it's something like lung cancer, I would have been, more worried. But yeah, I got my diagnosis a bit later, just at the start of Labour's local election campaign. And obviously, being the pandemic, things were being done over the phone. Well, as I say, we are still in a pandemic. Though Westminster refuses to acknowledge this. I got the diagnosis over a phone. So I was actually sat in a very cold car park in Bury, next to a community centre as the kind of the clouds gathered and the rain started coming down, and then while I was out knocking on doors after my diagnosis, the hail came, the snow came.
Bit Shakespearean.
The weather followed the diagnosis. But actually,
did they break the news to you in a sympathetic way?
Yeah, I guess as well as you can. I mean, you have to excuse my language, but they talked me through. I had Mr. Goodrell, who was the urologist at King George Hospital. Unbeknownst to me, the nurse was also listening in on the call, and she phoned me a few hours later, which was it's a brilliant idea, by the way, because I can tell you loads of what he said went in one ear and out the other, because I was still absorbing the shock. Mm-hmm. But he talked me through, and he then paused and said, so let me just sort of stop for a minute. How do you feel? Do you have any questions, any reactions? And I said, well, if I've understood you correctly, this is obviously bad news because it's cancer, and I'm very unlucky because, it's very unusual to have this type of cancer at my age. But on the other hand, you've caught it early. I'm not going to die. So all in all, I've probably not got much to worry about. And he laughed and said, well, that's a pretty good way to react to it. And I said, well, if you'll excuse my language, you've delivered the shit sandwich rather well. So that was sort of my reaction to it, really. And actually, from that moment onwards, the one thing I was absolutely assured of was that I wasn't going to die. But it was still, I was still processing the shock for the rest of the day. So to have that follow-up call with the nurse, by which time I'd scribbled down loads of questions and had a pen and paper handy so I could write stuff down, because one of the reasons I wasn't prepared when the call came is that it came slightly early, and the one thing he did do to disarm me was to say, I hope you don't mind me calling early, is now a good time? I thought, yeah, it's fine. And he said, I've got some really difficult cases this afternoon, so I thought I'd get you out the way earlier because yours was straightforward. So I'm instantly thinking, oh, this is really good news. And he started by talking about the kidney stone. I'm thinking, yeah, great, kidney stone. I mean, that's going to be painful and awful, but fine, we can deal with that. And then he said, however, and I thought, oh no, this is not good news. And the reason it's straightforward is because it is just a straightforward diagnosis and the treatment pathway will be straightforward. But no, I mean, I actually, it's a funny thing to say for someone who's gone through cancer, but I genuinely felt lucky all the way through because I kind of referred to that kidney stone as my lucky kidney stone. I was lucky it was caught early, and I knew all the way through that my outcome was very likely to be good. My surgeon, Ravi Barod at Royal Free, was outstanding.
Use a robot to remove the kidney?
Yep, and in fact I'm going to Cambridge tomorrow to look at the robot, not the robot, but to look at a robot, which is the
new company that are making the robot, is that right?
Yeah. And they're going to let me have a go of the robot. I don't think on a real life patient, or at least I hope not.
Not yet.
Put it this way, I'd love to be the Secretary of State for Health. I would not like to be a clinician in the health service, and I'm not sure anyone else would want me to be a clinician in the health service either. But.
Just a point about the breaking bad news, which is something actually we're thinking of running a course on for doctor training course. Because they say that if you break bad news well, people never forget you. But if they break bad news badly, they never forgive you, because it's that moment of realization that you've got something terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, I think actually you were terribly lucky that it was a 6-centimetre tumour, and these kidney cancers can spread to the lungs, and sometimes you do a chest x-ray and you find a lungs full of cancer where it's already spread, and that is really bad news. So you can imagine a doctor having to give that news as opposed to the good news that you're curable, and then to have the latest technology to do it.
And like lots of people, I've been through that before with other members of my family receiving really awful diagnoses. So, and the thing about, I mean, I don't envy your position as people who sometimes have to give very bad news, potentially, fatally bad news, because we're all different and we all respond to news, good or bad, in different ways. So, someone of an identical age, identical diagnosis might have responded in a very different way than I did. So, I don't know how you do that actually. And obviously I deal with the public all the time, and I know how difficult we can be. So, so I don't envy, staff working in the health service, because that must be one of the most difficult parts of the job, actually.
We'll come back, and I know the audience will be interested to talk about your views about where the health service is going and technology and so on, because I know you've been to Israel to look at new technology. But let's go back to your sort of backstory, which is kind of rags to riches, amazing story, isn't it?
I've not hit the riches bit yet. But
you're in reputational terms, you're very rich, which is a good place to be, because you're only 40, are you? Is that right?
Yeah, pushing 40. You just added 6 months. 40, 6 months onto me, but yeah.
Right. Sorry about that.
I'm worried about it.
Tell us about your upbringing in Stepney, and your unmarried mum and your granddad. Everybody's interested in your granddad, but tell us the story.
Yeah, so I grew up in Stepney in Tower Hamlets in East London, and it's fair to say I think the technical term for it is I was an accident. I was born to two very young parents. My dad was 17, about to turn 18. My mum was 18, about to turn 19, and their relationship did not last long. So I don't actually remember my parents being together, but as a result, my mum was kind of left. She wasn't left on her own in the sense my dad was always in my life, has always been supportive. In fact, I lived with my dad for the second half of my childhood. But my mum lived alone. She'd bring up a child, and it wasn't until actually I reached their age that I realised what a huge sacrifice that was, and how terrifying it must have been to child.
And she was in a Tower Hamlet tower block, is that right?
Well, eventually we got moved. So she was actually living at home with my nan, and she got a council flat, and so I grew up on a council estate in Tower Hamlets. Life was pretty difficult for my mum. She was in and out of kind of a series of low-paid, insecure jobs. The benefit system mostly put food in the fridge and money in the electricity meter, and often the money ran out, and so did the electricity. She relied on the big kind of extended family network across the East End of London, from sort of Bow right through to Wapping. So, she had that advantage, but it was pretty rough and pretty difficult upbringing for
When you look back on it now, did you feel stressed thinking about it, or were you happy as a child? And obviously you were bright, weren't you? They picked that up at school, that you were bright, right?
Yeah, I mean, for this, in spite of the hardship, and I was acutely aware growing up of the relative disadvantage that I faced, because I went to a primary school where half the kids were working class, either white working class or Bangladeshi working class, but we were at the poorer end of the poor kids, and by contrast, some of my really good friends were kids from the more middle class white families that moved into the Docklands around the 1980s. So we were kind of acutely aware of the fact that, or I was acutely aware of the fact that my family didn't have the same sorts of things that other people had.
And who was the big influence in you? Was it your grandfather?
Yeah, my paternal grandfather.
More than your dad?
Yes, actually, and I don't think it would pain my dad to acknowledge that. He just knows. I was very, very close to my granddad. I used to spend pretty much every weekend with him. He was massively supportive of me in every respect, in terms of my education, my faith. He was the ultimate kind of indulgent grandparent who would give their grandson anything that they wanted. We used to drive my dad crazy. So my dad has always been the person who sort of tried to keep my feet on the ground and to kind of be the sort of the firm hand of parenting. And so I was very, very lucky to have him in my life for first 10 years of my life. And a very stark contrast to the other granddad, which is the one that people tend to be more interested in, because
the gangster.
He had a string of convictions for armed robbery. So he was in and out of prison throughout my mum's childhood, which had big consequences for her childhood, her educational outcomes, a big impact on my grandmother's life, because she also got a conviction on account of my granddad, which is how she ended up being in prison while she was pregnant with my mum. So my mum actually spent the first 6 weeks of her life in Holloway Prison before she was handed over to the care of her grandmother.
Delivery was at the Whittington, was surrounded by prison officers.
Yeah, I think so.
Scary.
Yeah, so not great. And I'm afraid, I still think it's an outrage that there are, so many pregnant women in prison today.
But was she involved with your grandfather's robberies, or was it? I think I read somewhere that it was they pinned the fact that she had stolen.
Yeah, it was a stolen radio. I mean, I think probably her, the extent of her involvement, it was not something that was talked about much when I was growing up, because it was something that she was very ashamed of her criminal record. She was very active in the Labour Party in Tower Hamlets. She was encouraged to stand for the local council, but turned it down because she was worried that her criminal record would embarrass her, embarrass the family, embarrass the Labour Party. So it had a very long kind of impact on her opportunities and what she was able to do. But no, I think in terms of the conviction that she was in prison for, I think it was something to do with the stolen radio. And they were looking for my granddad. She refused to kind of hand him over, and as a result, they did her for a stolen radio to kind of as leverage.
Isn't it, really? But I've been reading some of the interviews he's done in the Financial Times and in I think Guardian Observer. I think it was. And I mean, the journalists love these backstories because it makes it so much more interesting. Christine Keeler, do you want to just mention that? She was in your. Was it your?
Yeah, she shared a cell with my nan. So, and they became lifelong friends throughout the rest of their lives. Very, very different women. But yeah, lifelong friends, and my nan always maintained that Christine Keeler also suffered a really grave injustice.
Yeah, they made a brilliant TV programme about her, I saw about a year ago, implying that she was a victim of the for all sorts of reasons. But so you were picked out as one of the bright kids at school, right? And then you went to Westminster
City School,
not
the other Westminster School.
Not the posh one, 40,000 a year.
The one that was affectionately known as Shitty City when I went there. And I hasten to add, because I still do lots of work for the school now, is a much better school than when I was there.
It's an academy now, right?
Yep. And their outcomes are much better. But for all the trouble that I had when I was at Westminster City, I mean, it was a school that went through special measures with Ofsted. And bear in mind, I was sent to that school because my primary school head teacher thought that state schools in Tower Hamlets were not good enough. At the sort of the end of the 80s, early 90s, she sent me off there.
Were you just picked out as a bright one to be sent to somewhere different from?
Yeah. So she encouraged my mum to send me to Westminster City, so I used to get on the tube every day from Stepney to Westminster.
Yeah. That's expensive. That so they had to pay the tube.
Well, we got free travel from the local authority.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's good. That is very good. And then getting into Cambridge from there, as opposed to the other Westminster, where although actually I think now they're trying to rebalance that a bit at Cambridge. But tell us a little bit about that. That must have been a very exciting moment to get that letter from Cambridge University.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I was strongly encouraged by my school to apply. I did a Sutton Trust summer school, so I'd spent some time at Cambridge doing their, Sutton Trust do a residential programme for a week where they give disadvantaged or pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds an experience of a week at Cambridge, and that reassured me that it was somewhere that I wanted to go rather than simply being encouraged to go. And I applied, got in, and loved every minute of it.
Read history there?
Yep, at Selwyn,
that big history faculty they've got there, Mary Beard and people like that.
Yep.
They're a pretty amazing place, isn't it? I assume you're happy to talk about this, that's where you decided to tell people that you were gay in your second year at Cambridge. That can't have been that easy to be open about that at that stage.
Yeah, it was a two-stage process really. First of all, I had to accept it myself, and then I had to build the confidence to tell other people. And it was the first time in my life that I felt kind of in an environment where I felt able to tell my friends. I mean, it's even now, I mean, sort of 20 years on, the transformation in attitudes, particularly among young people. I mean, obviously we've seen the change in attitudes in wider society, and one of the things I'm most proud of in terms of the last Labour government, and one of the things that makes me Labour, is that we didn't just change laws, we changed hearts and minds when it came to LGBT equality and actually a whole range of other social issues. And for a young generation now, I mean, I worked for a time at Stonewall before I became an MP, obviously going to schools now, and the sort of work they do on inclusion is completely unrecognisable compared to my education. And growing up when I did in under Section 28, undoubtedly created an environment that made it more difficult for people like me to accept who we are. And then
did you get bullied about it when you were at school?
There was lots of bullying in my secondary school. A lot of it was homophobic in its language, and even if kids didn't think you were gay, homophobic terms were the most commonly used, I would say. And again, on that count, there has been a sea change in attitudes, even just in the last 10 years amongst children and young people. If you think we used to measure through a study conducted by Cambridge University, the prevalence of, terms like "that's so gay," to and the prevalence of that use of homophobic language has fallen enormously over the last 10 years, let alone the last 20 years.
You have been accused of being too much a Blairite by some of the more left-wing elements of your party, but actually we were interviewing Kim Darroch, the ambassador to Washington, famously upset to Donald Trump, and he said that in his view those were the golden years, the Tony Blair years, because you're absolutely right, things changed in so many ways. So what are your views now, looking back about those years?
We won elections, so that was a good start.
Yeah.
I must admit, I kind of find the Blairite label really lazy. I thought it had passed its sell-by date when people started calling Gordon Brown a Blairite, and I thought you really haven't understood the dynamics of the new Labour years. Gordon Brown was very much not a Blairite. Tom Watson also described as a Blairite. I think Tom also laughs at that. I just think it's possible to be proud of the record of the last Labour government without believing it's perfect, and to want to try and replicate its success without thinking you can just bung the 97 manifesto in a microwave, reheat it, and then you've got a programme for the future. One of the things about New Labour, which I don't think is recognised enough, is where it sits in the kind of the grand sweep of the revisionist tradition in the Labour Party, which has existed since the Labour Party was founded more than 100 years ago, when people from the trade union movement, socialist societies, the cooperative movement, friendly societies decided it wasn't enough to march through the streets demanding change. You had to march through the corridors of power to deliver it. And the golden thread that runs right through the governments of Attlee, Wilson in particular, Callaghan, Blair, Brown, is that kind of revisionist mindset and the understanding that you take your traditional values and you apply them to the challenges of the future. You don't have a view that is preserved in aspic or believe that the challenges that the Labour Party were focused on in 1900 require the same answers today as they did then, even though depressingly some of the challenges remain the same. There's also been an awful lot of change. So I do find it frustrating when people like me who were, I was 14 years old when New Labour came to power, and I was 24 when Tony Blair left office. It just seems a bit lazy to label people from my generation Blairites. I have a lot of respect for Tony Blair. I talk to Tony Blair. I appreciate Tony Blair's perspective and advice. He is the only person alive who has led Labour to victory, so I think he's worth listening to. But that doesn't mean that...
Peter Mandelson likes you, I gather. You like him?
Yeah, Peter. I think
one of the great thinkers of politics.
I think one of the things about Peter Mandelson that I find frustrating in terms of his sort of public persona and reputation is people really underestimate how deep the Labour Party runs in his veins, in his family, his history. Obviously, his grandfather was Herbert Morrison. If you cut Peter Mandelson in half, it's kind of the Labour Party is written in the middle. And I think people like him, that generation of politicians who were in government, were able to make an enormous difference, are worth listening to. And the other thing I like about them is they're not backseat drivers, actually. They give advice. Sometimes you read occasional outbursts of frustration from former ministers from the Blair-Brown years about different elements of Labour opposition over the last 11 years. But if I were in their shoes and I had done the hard yards to get Labour into government, delivered enormous change over the course of that time in government, those 13 years in government, and then saw what the Labour Party had achieved since, I would be frustrated too. I am frustrated too. I think it's absurd the Labour Party has lost 4 election defeats in a row, and the thing that makes me most frustrated is that the big part of those defeats were largely self-inflicted. And I've always maintained the view that the Labour Party will win again when it wants to, and under Keir Starmer we certainly have a leader who wants to win, but I think the Labour Party is showing in the way that it's behaving at every level of the party, from the grassroots right through to the parliamentary party. The Labour Party is hungry to win again, and I think that's reflected in the way that that Keir leads us and the way that the Labour Party is performing at the moment.
And when Jeremy Corbyn was elected, did your heart sink?
Well, I sort of saw it coming. I kind of saw it coming.
Because we got
earlier.
Boris because of Jeremy, to something you could argue. I mean, there are other reasons as well, Brexit and so on, but Jeremy was not a great choice. Just give us the background to that from your perspective.
Well, initially, I was, I think like lots of people in the Labour Party, I just felt like I knew how that movie was going to end, and that's what I found most frustrating. And initially I thought, well, okay, whatever misgivings I have about this election, he's won with a clear mandate. And actually one of the things about the Corbyn platform was around a more democratic party, kind of gentler politics. And I thought, actually, we can work with that. I mean, because I do think sometimes when we're in government, we were too command and control, and there wasn't enough space for policy discussion. And I think the Labour Party is, it's always been a broad church. It's at its best when it's ecumenical. So I thought, well, at least there's a space for kind of debate, and then that was clearly did not become the case, and there was a pretty awful political culture inside the Labour Party. There's plenty of blame to be spread around. I think the self-criticism comes in that I don't think that the parliamentary party, myself included, gave either the impression or also the sort of the reality of acknowledging Jeremy Corbyn's mandate and working as effectively as we could early on and giving him enough time to fail on his own terms. But I think where I would disagree with lots of Jeremy Corbyn's biggest supporters is that I think he was always bound to fail. And that the reason why there was so much frustration, on the part of people like me was because I just think the Labour Party doesn't have time for self-indulgence and to take the view that you don't compromise with the electorate. It's our job to win power and change people's lives. And if you think about what's happened since Labour left office, we have seen the dismantling of the welfare state, a complete reverse in all of the improvements we made to public services and outcomes, and that's particularly true in the NHS, where you compare where we were when we left office to where we are now. We see rising levels of child poverty when we were supposed to be on course to end it by 2020. We've had a Brexit referendum that wouldn't have happened. We had the disaster of the outcome, which if the Labour Party had lifted a finger to do some campaigning, may not have happened, even having voted for and held the referendum. And we've ended up with the most right-wing populist conservative government I think we've had in modern history. And you only need to look at the Conservative leadership contest and the way in which that's playing out to see what a populist party the Conservative Party's become. And we've got to take some responsibility for that, and the way in which we take responsibility for that is to make sure we beat them next time and deliver a Labour government.
Which kind of brings me on. I can take some questions in a minute, but Keir Starmer, I was watching him in Prime Minister's Question Time today, always super professional. So much the lawyer in control, in charge. But some people say that he's not clear enough for policies for the future, and the word boring came up a couple of times in the last few weeks. So give us some insight into Keir. Maybe we should get him here, actually.
Oh, you should.
Yeah.
So I don't think Keir gets nearly enough credit for the transformation we've seen in the Labour Party in just over 2 years. If you had told me when Keir was first elected, or even when the leadership contest began, where it wasn't even inevitable that Keir Starmer would win, and people were wondering whether the Labour Party would even continue to exist as a major force in British politics, if you told me when Keir was first elected that within just over 2 years we would have changed the perception of the party on anti-Semitism, kicked a load of people out who should never have been in the Labour Party in the first place, changed the leadership in Scotland and now be in contention as a serious opposition party in Scotland with bigger ambitions that are now credible, and got to a point where the commentariat are saying, why isn't Labour on course for a landslide rather than, will Labour continue to exist? I just wouldn't have believed you. And Keir deserves an enormous amount of credit for that, because it wouldn't have happened without the leadership he brought. And the first half of Keir's leadership has necessarily been about trying to detoxify the Labour Party, to do the internal change that's necessary so the Labour Party can focus outward and build the coalition of support that we need. And I think he's done that very successfully. The next phase, which we're now in, is about taking a country that has, I think, largely turned its back on the Conservatives and take them on a journey that makes people want to vote Labour and feel excited about voting Labour and feeling confident that a Labour government can deliver the change our country needs. And we know we haven't done that job yet. We know there's much more to do on that front, but we're moving in the right direction, and we are, even up against a government with a majority of 80, we have been beating them. I mean, the fact we changed the tied-on windfall tax was a good start. Obviously, we unnerved the Conservatives over tax rises to such an extent that I think Conservative leadership candidates are spending more money than John McDonnell would have done if he'd been the Chancellor of the Exchequer through completely unfunded tax cuts in their case.
Splashing it around,
it's just been a total. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. These people are running to be the Prime Minister of our country, and those candidates, including the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, have just been coming up with completely fantasy policies and fantasy tax cuts and unfunded policies that if we did this, we'd be crucified for. So I know that sometimes people are frustrated and they think we're being too cautious at the moment, but that's because we know the Labour Party only wins when it addresses three fundamental questions that exist for every Labour opposition leader from the voters, which is, can we trust you with our money? Can we trust you with law and order? Can we trust you with national security? Now, I think we've shown through the Ukraine crisis and our response to that, both in terms of unequivocal support for Ukraine, but also for NATO, that we are serious about the armed forces and international security. I think Yvette Cooper, as Shadow Home Secretary, there's no doubt that she comes from the tough on crime, tough on the cause of crime school of thought and can be trusted on law and order and on the economy. Rachel Reeves, again, I would not imagine that we would have got here this quickly. Rachel Reeves is in a position as Shadow Chancellor of polling ahead of the Conservatives or polling evenly with the Conservatives on questions of who do you trust with the economy. Even on, I think I saw a couple of polls which asked who do you trust to keep your taxes low, and Labour were ahead. And the thing about that last one is, okay, that looks good for now, but Rachel knows, and Pat McFadden, our Shadow Chief Secretary, knows that all it takes is a bit of lax discipline, some shadow cabinet members going off beam, some unfunded spending commitments, some kind of big, bold, wide-eyed policies over here that you haven't costed and thought through to unravel that. And I genuinely think, however bad this government is, this is a largely risk-averse country, and changing government is not something that the voters tend to do lightly. And so we've got to make sure that when we go into that election that we are providing the kind of the radical vision for change that our country needs, but also providing the reassurance that a Labour Party can be trusted to deliver it. So if sometimes we seem a bit cautious, that's why.
I'm going to ask you about the Lib Lab Progressive Alliance.
There isn't one. There won't be one.
I thought you might say that, but then I'm going to give the mic to Nick Gash, who's chairman of our audit committee, and then maybe Jill after that. So I have to say Nick's wife is a Labour politician, so
Wes knows that. I know Wes of old. I actually wasn't given forewarning of this by Roger, but knowing Roger so well, I'm not entirely surprised. I suppose linked to that last question, I'll bring you on to a question relating to health. As I think you know, I'm a non-exec director at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital and chair the audit committee there. And clearly the health service, and I'm most familiar with the acute sector, is facing hugely challenging times. There are major workforce challenges in terms of the number of clinicians that we have, doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, major training challenges. The waiting lists are growing despite overperformance, certainly in our trust of 100 and something percent pre-COVID. But I recognise as well that much as I would like to say, let's throw more money at it, even under a Labour government before, when a lot of investment went in, there is a limited pot. What's your view about the way we can seek to meet those challenges, balance the reality, the expectations of the public, don't close our local A&E and all those sorts of campaigns, to build a health service that really can be world-class, address the issues of recovery, and linked to that, what's your view about the current reform towards integrated care systems? And I'll give you a hint, I welcome, whichever government imposed them, that we're actually getting towards more integration, more collaboration across the system. But how do you think we can square that circle? Because I accept that, much as I want, my background, there to be a Labour government, there is not a bottomless pit, and there never will be.
Yeah. A couple of things. One is I absolutely reject what Sajid Javid said before he left government, that the NHS has enough money. We've had more than a decade of underinvestment in the NHS, and even now there are real terms cuts being rolled out in the NHS. And that decade of underinvestment has had really serious consequences for our country. It left us more exposed to the pandemic than we would otherwise have been. It meant we went into the pandemic with NHS waiting lists already at a record 4.5 million, 100,000 staffing shortages in the NHS, and 112,000 vacancies in social care. So it isn't just that they failed to fix the roof while the sun was shining, they dismantled the roof and removed the floorboards. And now have the audacity to criticise parts of the NHS, whether general practice or other parts for suggesting that somehow they're not stepping up to the plate, or suggesting that so much money has now been given to the NHS, there are no excuses for the challenges that we now see. And so it's partly my job now in opposition to make sure that the Conservatives don't get away with passing the buck, passing the blame, or pretending this is all about a COVID backlog, when I would argue very strongly it's a Conservative backlog that we're now dealing with. There is a flip side to that, which is about public consent. I think there is an anxiety about the level of funding that the NHS has as a proportion of government spending, and an anxiety amongst the voters about the long-term sustainability of the NHS. They are absolutely wedded to, as I am, to the founding principles and model of the NHS, a publicly owned, publicly funded service free at the point of use, but they are frightened about whether or not such a system is sustainable in the long term. So I think collectively, the health service now, and I hope the next Labour government, also have to reassure the voters that we've got a very close eye on how their money is spent, to reassure them that we're spending it exactly as it should be to get the best and strongest impact. And so, one of the things I've said a number of times now is that the NHS at every level can't be complacent about regularly making that case, because I think it's crucial. If we're asking for more investment, it's really important to demonstrate that it's investment for a purpose, and to deliver real outcomes. And I think one of the ways in which we do that is to outline, at the same time as the immediate priority of bringing down the elective care backlog, which is going to be a big political focus, we also need to demonstrate that over a longer term period we're making the right choices now to put the NHS onto a more sustainable footing. And from my point of view, that means shifting the balance of spending in health and social care to focus much more on prevention and dealing with conditions when they cost hundreds of pounds or thousands of pounds, rather than hundreds of thousands of pounds or even over £1 million when you add up the cost of people's care because we didn't get there soon enough. I think it means making good, smart use of technology, particularly to improve the back office and to improve the patient experience and the navigation around the NHS, but also there are groundbreaking new treatments and technology that's already being rolled out, and new developments that are coming down the line. So we need to make sure we're well placed to take advantage of that technological revolution. And thirdly, we've got to deal with social care, because contrary to what I heard government say today, I think Boris Johnson claimed that the government have fixed social care. Well, that's news to me, and it's also news to the poor acutes who are desperately trying to get people out of the exit door to the hospital, but are having to grapple with 400,000 or so delayed discharges each month because the social care just isn't there. And so that's why I think for me, a test of the ICSs is, notwithstanding the pressure on trusts and the acutes, because I know that they're under pressure, the test for me for ICSs as they're currently constituted is, are they shifting some of that resource now in social care to free up the exit door and improve the flow through the hospital, or are people still thinking in silos? I've seen some good examples already. I mean, I was up at the Leeds General Infirmary with Rachel Reeves the other week, where they are using some of their money now as a trust to invest through Leeds City Council in social care to help deal with some of those delayed discharges. Because my instinct on ICS is I want to see more integration. If anything, I don't think they go far enough in terms of things like pooled budgeting, which I'm really keen to explore. But in terms of what people can anticipate a Labour government doing, it would be evolution rather than counter-revolution when it comes to ICSs. And one of the areas in which I'm treading most cautiously is anything to do with structural reform, because I'm just conscious of the fact that there are already a number of structural reforms still being rolled out. They're often pulling in different directions. Every time you do a big structural reform, that means pause, it means disruption, and often it means unintended consequences. And that's before we factor in the wisdom of any one of the number of structural reforms that Secretaries of State have imposed. So people do not have to lie awake at night worrying about the Streeting plan for NHS structures, because that is not the way I want to make my name as a health secretary. I want people to look back on my time as health secretary and think look at what he did with the elective backlog, and didn't he make the right long-term choices to put the NHS and social care system on a sustainable footing for the 21st century?
Great answer. Professor Jill Leng, who used to be CEO of NICE. Jill.
Thanks, Roger. I've got two questions, if I'm allowed. And the first one is indeed about NICE, because I worked there for over 20 years, and it was set up by the first Blair government and remarkably has survived. I think it's the only wanko that did, and set up with a role explicitly to look at what's value for money and to help the NHS manage those difficult decisions around new investment and keeping the show on the road. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the future of NICE and its role. And shall I ask the second question now?
Yeah.
Second question is about end of life, because my husband had a cancer diagnosis in 2017, and sadly it wasn't a positive one. The message we took home was treatable but not curable, and he got very keen to have some control of his end of life. He got interested in the assisted dying debate. And of course it's sort of coming quite an issue, and it's something that may well be voted through in Scotland, in the Isle of Man, in Jersey. And I think 85% of the public's supposed to support some form of assisted dying, so you can take some control at end of life. And I wondered if you had any thoughts or views on that and how it might move forward. So NICE and end of life.
Sure. Good news for NICE. No plans to shut that down. It seems to be working rather well. I mean, I should be asking you the questions, actually, given your experience. But
Later.
I mean, one of the things I'm sort of keen to look at is, I mean, I'm really worried about the extent to which we already have a two-tier health system in this country. And I see that manifesting itself in a couple of ways, in particular. One is the numbers of people who are now paying for their own healthcare. It's kind of basically doubled over the course of a decade. And secondly, I am increasingly conscious of the fact that there are treatments that are being made available to people through private healthcare that are not being made available through the NHS. And I want to understand why that is and how we fix it, because I recognise this is a lot more complicated than a politician just saying we're going to end that and it's going to be equal footing. But that's where I'd like to get to, so I want to understand some of the challenges as to why we've ended up where we have. And secondly, on end of life care, of all the questions I've faced in 7 years as an MP, this has been the hardest one. We very early on in my time, we had a private member's bill in the Commons from Rob Maris, and it's one of the, I'm not sure how well this reflects on me or the House of Commons, but it's the first time I've sat and listened to a full House of Commons debate, genuinely undecided and informed by the arguments around me, having arrived with a firm view and, a bit of partisan knockabout. And I had been instinctively against assisted dying until one of my constituents came to see me and in very powerful personal terms explained why that choice would have made a massive difference to her mother and to her. And so I promised to reopen my mind and to go and listen. And then I came to the conclusion, having listened to the debate, that it wasn't the principle of assisted dying that I was most concerned about, because there are lots of social issues where we might take a principled view, philosophical view, moral view, but as a legislator I kind of tend to take a secular view on those questions and think it's not for me to impose my beliefs on others, it's for other people to reach a view. It was more about the practicalities. So actually I ended up voting in favour of the assisted dying bill at second reading, on the basis that I thought it would be helpful for that bill to continue to be debated, for those sorts of challenges to be thoroughly considered, because I think we need to look at the checks and balances to avoid coercion, either direct coercion or self-imposed coercion, the sort of the guilt that people may apply to themselves. I don't want to burden my family, sorts of considerations. And also, one thing I'm absolutely determined is that if we go ahead with assisted dying, we have to sort out palliative care, because people should not be choosing or feeling forced to end their life sooner than they would wish, because for another reason the palliative care isn't good enough, so we need to fix that too. But obviously this is a conscience issue, so this is not the Labour Party's view. It is something that MPs have to and peers have to make a decision on, regardless of party affiliation. But that's where this is where I remain on the issue. I think so long as the safeguards are there, and so long as we sort out palliative care, having listened to people who are directly affected, I would want them to be able to make the choice for themselves, and just pray that I never end up having to make the choice for me or for someone that I love. But I think on reflection, I would like that choice to be there. Certainly if Scotland goes ahead with this, I think that changes the dynamic in a completely different way, because this is a country in the United Kingdom. And so I think there are them questions about, it's one thing people going up to Gretna for kind of marriage on the spot, but I think there's a different consideration here. So I think we'd have to think about how other parts of the UK respond to the Scottish debate.
Good. Any other questions in the audience? Hands up. Maybe you could pass the microphone. Thanks, Jill.
Hello, good evening, our President and Mr. Wes Streeting. Nice to see you all today evening. And I'm actually working as pathologist in St. Peter Hospital in Surrey. So it was just to converse with you my experience of your Labour Party things and political issues, which is very interesting out of our subject daily. We are tired with our subject. So you said the East London thing. So I used to live in East London those days in 96 when I came here until 2000. And that time, and the Labour Party was the golden era, I think. And I actually voted for the Chancellor votings. Frank Dobson, I voted Labour Party, but unfortunately he was defeated by the dissident Ken Livingstone. I remember still that one. And and I was very fancied for Blair's and his time, and he was very good. So I was totally supporting for several years your party anyway. I went to Warrington, and there also I was in that area. And so it was a flourishing period. I don't know why you have not succeeded in recent years in the elections. I was not sure. But as you know, we are candidates. We are not strictly for any party. We might change our views according to the area we live, and we can change influenced by the local things. So now I am in Chertsey since 2009, and I suddenly changed my mind when I received a letter directly from Philip Hammond to vote for him. So I voted he has won. And since then, I am with, and the now conservative area I am, and I am fully supporting them since these 14 years. So politics are very changing unless the leadership matters in your area, I believe. In politics, you should have a proper leader. I'm not sure how Keir Starmer, I have read a few things about him. He's okay leading you. But I listened to your talk today. I felt you are a very honest politician, and your experiences are very helpful for the society to develop the things what we need in United Kingdom. I think I wish you very honest promotions to lead at least for some of the areas. And even I was supportive for May Theresa and all now, and because I live in Staines. And we'll hope you might, now this turmoil this week was a little bit concerned because I voted for Boris Johnson's government because for the Brexit and everything. I was supporting because my colleagues in my place, we were all for that since those years.
That's more of a comment than a question.
It is a conversation, just
it's a
to tell, because he's
Well,
politician. and I would also tell about some medical things which Labour should be able to do in case if they come into power in future. One is, as you said, that you touched about the tax things. It is tremendously high during the Conservative Party, so those things. And the other things are to touch for the workloads, and the funding is very good in NHS. I'm not saying we are having less funding, but where it is utilized in proper areas or no, the bureaucracy and the managerialship, and where it is going. Not enough nurses, not enough technicians, not enough doctors. These areas all to be addressed properly in the committee meetings, in the politics. So that way it has to be having in their agenda when they propaganda for the next elections. That
But
is what
that-
I wish you would
thank
cheer
you.
up and
Thank you.
get
That was the
for this.
longest
Thank you so
question
much.
that I've ever heard. But,
Thank you for giving me time and
Thank you.
opportunity,
Let-
and I wish you good
Let's
luck.
just talk about workforce issues,
Yeah.
because Matt Hancock was here, I think, a couple of years ago, and he said that was his big worry. And since then, we're...
He also wasn't that big because I'm not sure what he did. But
well, he didn't do much, and we're in worse shape now than we were
Yeah.
2 years ago. So what would you do if you were elected about the workforce? You know, loss short of doctors, short of nurses, short of technicians, etc., etc.
yeah, so one of the surprising things about sort of politics today, particularly on health and social care, is the sort of unholy alliance we have with Jeremy Hunt, who is the chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee. Obviously, he got knocked out of the leadership race. But obviously, I would not speak in particularly flattering terms about Jeremy's time as the Secretary of State for Health. And I've kind of teased him, saying, his time was so unsuccessful, he had to write a book listing all of his failures because an essay wasn't long enough. But actually, one of the things I will say for Jeremy, more charitably, is that and he knows this, I was very anxious about the idea of Jeremy Hunt becoming chair of the Select Committee, because I thought, how can you mark your own homework? And you're having to look at so many of the consequences, decisions that you've taken. But to be fair to him, he can point to a whole number of examples of things that he said, which are actually either unconsciously self-critical, but in lots of cases consciously self-critical. And that is a big focus of his book, which, by the way, I'm not here to plug, and I'm not getting any commission. But he and I have worked really closely together on this question of workforce and tried really hard around the health and care bill to defeat the government, or even better, to persuade them to undertake an independent assessment of the workforce needs of the NHS now and into the future. Because I think this should be, and this is something I'm absolutely committed to doing if we're in government, we do need a kind of an OBR-style independent assessment of what the workforce needs are. Because this is an organisation that currently employs about 1.4 million people. I can't think of a single organisation of half that size, a quarter of that size, a tenth of that size, that would not have at board level a regular report on people, the workforce, recruitment, retention, training. And some of that exists at trust level and nationally, but nothing resembling what I think is the seriousness of analysis and a plan. And I think that's needed, and Parliament needs to have that to hold ministers to account and to make sure that Secretaries of State and ministers passing through the department as temporary custodians are not making short-termist decisions, but making long-term decisions, especially when you think about how long it takes to train a lot of healthcare professionals. So we're absolutely committed to that. I do think there are some things immediately the government can and should be doing on workforce. It is crazy to me that people are retiring early for no other reason than the cap on pension contributions and the financial disincentive to stay within the health service. This is crazy. And how have we gone from, as one GP put it to me this morning, we went from trying to politely, and in some cases rather less politely in policy terms, telling GPs in their late 70s and 80s that it was time to retire, to now having to beg people in their 50s not to leave. This is crazy. So they could do something about that straight away. The last batch of data I saw showed that there were 800 medicine graduates who hadn't found junior doctor places. Put them to work. That's what these people have just kind of gone through. A huge amount of time, effort and energy to graduate in medicine, and they want these opportunities, and we need them to have them. So why is that not working more effectively? And those are just the sort of the immediate now. I mean, those things don't fix the crisis. I'm not kind of naive about that, but it's a good start. And I think one of the big challenges I have, or I hope to have anyway, at the moment it's a theoretical challenge, but one of the challenges I hope to have is making sure that we are able to recruit at pace the staff that we need, because the other thing we can't continue doing as a country is just pulling the immigration lever to solve our domestic staffing issues in the NHS and social care. The NHS, as far as I'm concerned, will always be an international workforce. I'm really proud of the fact that there are people from all over the world who want to come and work in this country and to be part of the NHS. I think they bring with them a range of experience and expertise which enriches the health service in this country. But there are also some moral and ethical dilemmas that come with that, not least the fact that we are recruiting lots of people from countries who desperately need those staff themselves. Some of them are very poor countries. So I think there are ethical issues there. But I think if we can, spend more time recruiting and training and retaining our own homegrown talent, that would be good for our country, good for the health and social care system. And again, it will be one of those things that people, I hope, look back on and say, gosh, wasn't Wes Streeting good on workforce when he was the Secretary of State? Beating the door down to that awful Treasury, say no to everything and getting the NHS the money it needs for recruitment.
Isn't there a move to increase the number of medical students by about 50% from 10,000 to 15,000? I think somebody mentioned that. Are you aware of that possibility? It's getting more doctors in.
Yeah, they're going very slowly. I mean, one of the things that has happened, and I wouldn't criticise, quite the opposite, has been the opening of new medical schools, particularly in parts of the country that do not have such a strong tradition of sending young people or indeed mature students to university. And as well as increasing the numbers, I also want to widen participation in medicine to students from underrepresented backgrounds, because it is still a rather elite profession, and I want to change the face of the profession in that way so that we are, talent is everywhere, opportunity isn't. And when you look at some of the areas that really struggle in terms of recruitment of staff, if we are able to have a stronger training offer in those regions, we will find people who maybe hadn't considered a career in medicine, give them the right kind of support, open that door to them, they will do it, and they will likely want to stay in and around the region or the communities where they grew up. And that would be brilliant for so many areas of the health service where, there's a general challenge in recruitment and in staff numbers, but in some parts of the country, particularly rural and coastal communities, we've got a really big problem making sure we've got the right people in the right places. And I think expanding access to medicine in those parts of the country would be a really impactful way of dealing with it.
It'd be a great idea. Blow our own trumpet. We had some sixth formers from Mulberry School in the East End down here, and we were talking to them about how to get into medical school, because there are challenges for kids from underprivileged scenarios to competing with the ones from public schools to actually get the places. And
yeah.
I think the RSM could do a lot to level up. To use an in-expression, as it were. Well, it's nearly 8 o'clock. Last question from me, because I think I heard, there's a question over there. Yeah?
We could do a round, couldn't we?
Okay, maybe two. We shouldn't be too late beyond 8 o'clock, but last two questions then.
Got a very short question.
Yep, keep it short.
Mr. Streeting, what is your view of the American domination of the private sector health service in London to the disadvantages, I'm sure, of the National Health Service? You've got HCA with its 6 or 8 hospitals, then you've got recently the arrival of Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic. What good, if any, is this for the National Health Service?
Yeah, bluntly, I'm not sure it's doing much for the National Health Service. I'm totally kind of conscious of the fact that, and I've kind of been pretty direct about this, which is not a popular message for a Labour Party audience. I accept that in order to bring the elective backlog down, there is an opportunity to use private sector capacity to bring down NHS waiting lists. And actually, on a principled level, I don't find that a difficult choice to make, because the alternative is people who can pay to jump the queue do, and those who can't wait longer, and that's deeply unjust and unfair. But I also don't think that is an acceptable long-term solution, and my ambition is to make sure the NHS is so good that people don't feel they need to pay to go private, but also to make sure there's capacity in the NHS so that the NHS doesn't have to pay for people to go private either, because there is a cost associated with it. So yeah, it's not something I'm particularly relaxed about, but in terms of the kind of the principal choice, you know, independent providers tell us that they're currently operating far below pre-pandemic capacity, and there's a lot that they could offer. So, you know, we'll take advantage of that. But there are also, as I'm very conscious of the sort of recent study that was published and reported on, which also talks about outcomes, patient safety, mortality. So we've got to make sure that there are high standards, and actually hold private providers to high standards as well. If they're going to be in the business, the literal business of providing healthcare in this country, I think they need to be in the business of providing excellent, high quality, safe healthcare in this country. And if they don't feel able to provide that, there are plenty of other markets that they could fish in.
Good answer. Last question.
I will be quick. Thank you very much. It's very good listening to you, and I'm very proud of your experience in the National Health Service, having worked in it for 42 years. Now, my question is, you talked about workforce issue. Pre-registration nursing students have to now take a loan to complete their training and start on band 5. Now, what is the Labour Party going to do about changing the bursary, going back to the bursary, and also the international recruitment? The welfare of these nurses when they arrive is very, very appalling. We need to streamline it, make it under one umbrella so that agencies don't go in, recruit nurses, bring them into this country. A nurse was living in a caravan in a park in one of these counties in England. Somebody coming to nurse, they couldn't even find accommodation. He was living in a caravan. So we need to address these issues. Recruitment and retention is very important. We can grow our own, but please, let's make it better for them. Thank you.
Well, on your second point, thank you for raising that, because it's not just that it's an appalling way to treat someone who's come over to our country to help and to provide a really important service. It's also potentially harmful to patients. I don't want nurses arriving for work exhausted because they're sleeping in poor conditions. I think of all of the, there are lots of manifestations of things that are wrong with this government, obviously, but I think the fact we've got NHS hospitals setting up food banks for their own staff tells us something about how bad things are for lower paid staff, and we've got to deal with that. And on the NHS bursary, these are the sorts of questions I dread at this stage in opposition, because it's so specific and requires a specific answer, and I don't like avoiding questions. But it also tempting me into making an unfunded spending commitment, and I've told you I'm not allowed to do that. It'd be a fun experiment into the wrath of Rachel Reeves, but no thank you. All I will say is that, the first debate that I led as a backbencher after I was elected in 2015 was an adjournment debate in opposition to the scrapping of the NHS bursary. I thought it was an appallingly short-sighted decision. The consequences were not just predictable, but predicted. I'm a former president of the National Union of Students, and the warning I gave to the government in 2015 was, look at the demography of student nurses, look at the experience of increasing tuition fees and the impact on mature student numbers, and then ask yourself why on earth you're going ahead with scrapping the NHS bursary and charging these students tuition fees. So I know that this is an issue we've got to deal with in terms of financial support and making nursing an attractive profession, and recognising that if we want to continue to have a pipeline of career experienced people of a certain age and maturity who bring that experience to bear in nursing, even if they haven't worked in a caring profession before, then we need to recognise that for those students in particular, there are just completely different financial considerations to people like me who are 18-year-old school leavers and wanting to go to university. So we've got to deal with that issue, and it's very much on my agenda, even if I haven't got a clear answer for you now.
Thank you very much. Let's finish with a show of hands. Hands up those who think that Wes Streeting is going to make a really great Minister of Health in the future.
Oh, wow.
I think you've got pretty much unanimity. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you
This
so much.
is, yeah. Thank you.